Jaime has over 2 decades of experience in the ESG space and has held positions at the United Nations and World Bank. Her prior role as the regional manager for the United Nations Climate Convention body, the Climate Technology Center and Network, Jaime led the Asia-Pacific team in developing and financing climate mitigation and adaptation technologies for cities and urban development. Her role involved managing partnerships with governments, the private sector, and Indigenous peoples and local communities to identify green growth policies, legislation, and actions. In addition to her work with the Climate Convention, Jaime held a number of positions at the UN Environmental Program, where she worked directly on urban sustainability projects, including Kenya's plastic bags ban and Morocco's Green Campus initiative. Jaime has delivered courses with the University of Southern Denmark on urban resilience, training municipal employees from 12 different countries, and at the invitation of the city of Copenhagen, chaired dialogues at the C40 Mayor Summit on financing municipal climate action. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Jaime to the stage.
All right, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So I am actually looking at ESG from a slightly different perspective, which is looking at how we can talk about ESG. Do we approach it from the perspective first and foremost of impact, or second from measurement? And we've heard a lot today about measurements and standards. And so I want to just start off, there we go. I want to start off by talking about 2 different concepts I'm going to be touching on in my presentation. The first is ESG. We've been talking about ESG. This is a conference on ESG, but what exactly is ESG? ESG is largely an industry term that's been spread across industries, but it's unique in that it's open to interpretation. And it's focused on risk and opportunities. And when you look at ESG and ESG policies and structures, they're largely industry specific. The Sustainable Development Goals, on the other hand, they're aspirational. They're focused first and foremost on impact, and they're designed specifically to avoid silos and to build connections. And that's why I love this representation of the SDGs as a wheel, because it does bring everything together around one overall goal, which is building a better future. So where do many people start? Many people, when they're talking about ESG, they start with the standards. And here's a few. You've got CDP standards, ISO standards covering everything from health and safety to carbon. You have what used to be SASB standards, which are now ISB standards. And then one that I actually really support, which is the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which again, begins with the standards, but does put it within the kind of a little slightly broader framework than perhaps the ISO standards. Now, I'm looking specifically here just to give you a little bit of an idea of what I'm talking about when I say standards. These are the SBTi standards guidance for cement. I usually work in a place where I can mix concrete and cement, and nobody minds, but I realize that here I should not be mixing concrete and cement. So these are the cement guidance. And what you'll notice about the cement guidance for SBTi is it's all about carbon. So they're talking about, all right, we need to reduce carbon, we need to hit net zero. How are we going to do that? We're going to do that through abatement, we're going to do that through removals, we're going to do that through efficiency. But it's still entirely focused on carbon. And that can lead us down a bit of a dangerous pathway. So we've been talking a lot about carbon, we've been talking a lot about net zero, but let's not focus only on that. Because what can happen if you start to go down that path? I'm going to give you 2 scenarios. And some of you are going to be able to kind of see through these scenarios and understand different aspects of it, whether it's the cost to achieve those scenarios or the outcomes that you're likely to achieve for those scenarios. But I just want you to start thinking about it. So the first scenario, we're looking at a 50 household development in BC. And we're assuming that the average household annual energy use on heating is 16,000 kilowatt hours. That's the Canadian average. So we're not pulling it out of our hats. I do recognize that BC might be slightly lower than, say, Nunavut, but for the purpose of the scenario planning, we are just using the Canadian national average. And our goal, so you're going in and somebody said to you, we want to achieve a 10% energy efficiency target for heating. So we want to increase the efficiency of our whatever heating source we're using by 10%. And that's what you've been told to do. So off you go, whether you're the architect, the mechanical engineer, the designer, the contractor, this is your target and you're going to go out and achieve it. Congratulations, you've done it. You have increased energy efficiency. You've reduced household energy use for heating by 10%. Now, I want you to guess. When you look at the impact, do you think that you have removed the equivalent of 5, 10, 15, or 20 standard gas-powered cars from the roads? Just think about it. I'm not going to give you the answer just yet. We're going to go to scenario 2. But just have a guess. Now let's move on to the second scenario. We're going to Alberta. So I think we just had a presentation with the city of Edmonton. You're going to have a little bit of an advanced, a little bit of special insight on this one. So ask him. He's going to be able to give you the answer. Same thing, 50 household development in Alberta. We're assuming the same energy use as we did in BC. But instead of increasing energy efficiency, what you're doing is you've been told that we want to move away from natural gas, that it has a high greenhouse gas emission coefficient. So you want to switch 50 households from natural gas to electricity. This is what you've been told to do because you're based out of Toronto, and this is your corporate target. Your corporate target, somebody's told you, hey, we got to get away from natural gas. Great, so you've done it. You go up to your boss, you're like, you told me to do this, I've done it. Another question for you. You have now removed the equivalent of how many cars from the road? And I'm up them this time, 10, 20, 30, or 50. Let's move on to the answers. In scenario 1, by increasing energy efficiency in a 50 household development in BC, you have removed the equivalent of 1/4 of a car from the road. By switching from natural gas to electricity in Alberta, you've actually added a car and a half to the road. Now, I want you to think of approximately how much it costs you to do that. And I want you to think of what you could do with that money to take 1/4 of a car off the road in your 50 household development. Could you switch 1/4 of a car equivalent to plug-in hybrid? Except in Alberta. We don't want to do that either. We'll get to that later. Could you improve public transport? Could you make it safer for children and women to walk to the bus stop? Could you build in walkable communities, bring in more amenities so that fewer people are driving? What can you do? And that's why it's really important to start with impact, because if you're just listening to your head office and the targets they've set under ISO or SBTI or the Task Force on Nation-Based Disclosures, you might be heading down the wrong pathway. What do I suggest as the alternative? I actually suggest basing your actions on impact. The global community has agreed that building a better future requires action across sectors. That if you build the perfect net zero community, but you don't have habitat for pollinators, or you've created space that isn't welcoming to certain groups of people, that you're not actually building a better world. You might be building a net zero world, but you're not building a better world. By framing your ESG strategy within the framework of the SDGs, you actually immediately raise the bar on your potential upside. And so how do you do that? First, you start by understanding the impact that you can have, not the impact that necessarily head office has told you you've had, or the standards have told you you had, or that you need to report on, but the impact that you can have. And then you focus on the connections, not the silos. So instead of saying, which column are we going to be filling in on a reporting sheet, you're saying, how many columns can we fill in on a reporting sheet through this action? And finally, you need to make your plan and your reporting multidimensional. And this is really important for capturing the value of your investments, because if you continue to report in a single dimension way, if you continue to report on energy efficiency targets, conversion from natural gas targets, even if you report on greenhouse gas emission targets, you're not capturing the full impact. And so you're going to be losing out on your own upside, your ability to attract employees, your ability to attract staff, your ability to appeal to shareholders, to those investors. Because believe me, those investors, it's not going to cut it to say, we are reducing our carbon emissions. That's baseline now. And if you look at what's happening in Europe, you're already 10 steps behind if what you're going to an investor is doing is saying, I'm going to reduce my greenhouse gas emissions. They're going to say, what else? And if you don't have an answer for that, you're going to miss out on those hundreds of billions of dollars. And I wanted to give you an example. We heard Denmark mentioned earlier. So Denmark did build in new building codes focused on greenhouse gas emissions. But they actually based their review of building codes on the Sustainable Development Goal framework. And what did that mean? It didn't mean that they just came out with building codes looking at greenhouse gas emissions. They also came out with a green roof building code. Why? Not because green roofs are something that somebody said is nice, but because they looked at the issues that they needed to impact. They looked at the fact that changing rainfall patterns meant that they needed to look at how water was flowing through the cities. They looked at the fact that pollution is still a significant detrimental health impact, and it is in Canada too. So for those of you who say the Sustainable Development Goals are for developing countries, less than 30% of Canadians live in areas where air quality standards meet the minimum every day of the year. Okay? We need to do better. Green roofs, they also provide key habitat for pollinators, and they decrease the overall impact of climate change in terms of the heat impacts in the city. So they took one single legislation, what do we do with the roofs of our buildings? And they said, how many sustainable development goals can we benefit? What can we achieve in terms of the overall better world that we're trying to move towards, rather than just what can we do to address one single factor? I'm giving you a second example. Now, so this, sorry. So the SDG approach, we talked about that within the framework of regulators, Copenhagen and Denmark's building regulations. But it's not just a tool for regulators. It's also a tool for developers. This is an example of a mapping that I helped a development company here in Vancouver do, where we looked at a new development and we started looking at how everyone in the process, from subcontractors to architects to even the marketing and sales team, could contribute positively to one or more of the Sustainable Development Goals. And we started to map it out. And we said, well, listen, this development can actually do something to reduce the vulnerability of the people living in this development to the impacts of climate change. It can actually do something to build in new innovations and new technologies as part of the sustainable consumption and production SDG. It can build a more walkable, safer space for people. It can reduce air pollution. And so by starting there, the company's approach to ESG shifted away from one silo-focused reporting to understanding what investments could be made to maximize impact across different elements of ESG. So they took ESG beyond carbon. And it's very, very important that even though we're talking about net zero, that as you're approaching your net zero strategy plan, that you look beyond carbon. Because if you don't look beyond carbon, not only are you missing out on opportunities to achieve multiple benefits, but you're also, unfortunately, facing the risk that you're going to achieve negative impacts, whether it's for climate change, for adaptation, or for the people that you're supposed to be building this better future for. So I'm going to just pause there. I would invite you to, we are a charity. Please do visit us online. For those of you who are Toronto-based and would like to learn more about UNA Canada, catch me after the presentation. We've got a gala coming up on October 26th in Toronto. If you catch me, I'll give you a 20% off code for tickets to that event. It's going to be amazing. We are welcoming supermodel Winnie Harlow to talk about diversity in the venture capital space. beyond that, I just really want to, this slide, okay, sorry, this slide came out of order. So this is, I was wondering where that was and thought I missed it. So now you've decided you want to donate and come and join us at our gala. And I'm going to tell you what you're going to get out of applying an SDG approach rather than, and this actually explains why my notes are out of order as well. By applying an SDG approach, you're going to identify new tools and approaches. An example would be nature-based climate solutions as a way of achieving your net zero. And that's going to allow you to have greater impact with lower cost. You can report on action impact beyond standards because you will be creating impact across standards. You'll also discover the impact between positive social and environmental outcomes. And it's really important that as we move forward as a society, we do look to capture those complementarities between social and environmental outcomes. And by applying the SDG approach, you are still achieving a compliance. So you're not giving anything up by by taking this approach. So apologies for that being slightly out of order, but that does actually bring me to the end of my presentation. If there's any questions or comments, happy to take those now. Thank you.
Where these SDG guidelines are available through your website?
Yeah, so the SDGs, we do have information on the SDGs on our website, including, if you want, I can send you our SDG manual, which we actually use when we're going into high schools for kind of sharing information on what the SDGs are, but I find it's also very good for industry as well, who are first learning about the SDGs. So you'll find some information on our website, and you can just drop me a line, and I'll make sure you get the SDG handbook. But it is really important that you do mapping on a project-by-project or portfolio-by-portfolio basis, because what's relevant in one environment is not necessarily going to be relevant in another. And if you want to actually look at how you're maximizing your impact, that first step of SDG mapping to a project or an investment is really the most critical one. But it's also where you get to really engage with your staff. And that's what we've seen. We've seen people that have come into the argument saying, oh yeah, but don't you know that electric vehicles are actually worse for the environment than regular cars? And they come into the discussion talking about that. But when you start to challenge them and say, all right, well, I want to know what you, as head of construction, where do you think you can have impact then? I'm not asking you about electric vehicles. I'm asking you where you think you can have an impact. And suddenly that switches a narrative, and people that are somewhat resistant can say, oh, well, actually, we can change the way we build curbs. And if we build curbs slightly lower, then we're changing the runoff scenario, we're reducing pollution because we'll put in these traps. And people are really, really creative when you give them the space to be creative rather than mandating what they're supposed to be achieving. Any other questions? Did you get the right answer on that Alberta question? Hey, there you go. So if I had a prize, I'd give it to you. I don't, but you can get 25% off. Yeah.
A quick one. Between the UN associations, where I imagine everyone's really positive on the change we can make, through to decision makers and countries, where do you start to see the pushback?
We see the pushback at the bridge between regulation and action. And I think that's because there's still a lot of tension in who's responsible for regulation versus who's responsible for action. And we see industry leading the way where they're given the freedom to lead the way and the political support. So, industry is quite often very happy to say, we want to be ambitious, we're going to lead the way, but we need to know that if we do, that the policymakers are going to back us up and not bring in regulatory conditions that are not actually compatible with the roadmap that we've put forward. I was talking to somebody last night, and I also work with the mining sector. And in many ways, the mining sector is far ahead of the construction and development sector when it comes to net zero and nature positive targets. And part of that reason is because they are very strong in lobbying, and so they knew going in that if they were to develop the roadmaps, that the policymakers and the regulators would fall in line and support their approach. So quite often that tension between regulators and industry can be very easily alleviated just by walking in step together and understanding, again, we're working towards the same impact and clarifying those roles. But yeah, that's where it very, very often breaks down, and not just in Canada. I've seen it certainly in Indonesia, Sri Lanka, South Africa has very significant, actually South Africa is a very similar case. If you're ever looking for complementary case studies to Canada, South Africa will quite often have them in the SDG and net zero space. All right, well, thank you very much. I'll pass it back to you then, Geneviève. Thank you very much for having me.